Hi everyone. Um, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you all for joining today. There's quite a few of us, and thank you for making the time to do this in the middle of your day. Actually, that's very Eurocentric of me. Maybe it's not the middle of your day wherever you are. Thank you for joining from all around the world. At Rethinking Economics, we call for an economics education that is critical, reflective of the challenges and injustices in the world around us, and recognizes and challenges systemic power imbalances that persist on the basis of race, gender, religion, and colonialism. In the context of the Israeli army's ongoing bombardment and assault in the southern Palestinian city of Rafah, the continued Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip, and the escalation of violence in the West Bank, Rethinking Economics would like to use this event to understand how the political economy of Palestine and apartheid operates in a historical as well as a contemporary sense. This session has been organized by network members from Rethinking Economics for South Africa, Rethinking Economics for India, and Rethinking Economics SOAS. To introduce myself, my name is Shloka Murarka. I will be facilitating today, and I'm from Rethinking Economics SOAS. The session will begin with presentations from Professor Ibrahim Shikaki, followed by Professor Amal Ahmad, followed by plenty of time for discussion. So please note down all your questions. As part of this event, we're encouraging participants to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Palestine. There's little we can do, but we should be doing the little we can do. By donating to medical aid for Palestinians and other charitable organizations supporting the aid effort, especially personal fundraising established by Palestinians on the ground. So I'm just going to introduce our speakers and then let them take over. First, we have Professor Ibrahim Shikaki. He is Assistant Professor of Economics at Trinity College, Connecticut. Ibrahim earned his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, New York, in 2019. Prior to pursuing his PhD degree, he worked with local and international institutions conducting economic and policy research in Palestine. His research revolves around macroeconomics, distribution and inequality, heterodox growth models, and political economy. He is particularly interested in identifying and rectifying the shortcomings of macroeconomic analysis when studying the diverse political, social, and institutional context of developing countries. Next, we have Professor Amal Ahmad. She's Assistant Professor of Development Economics Group at the Wahidanian University. In her research, she uses theoretical and applied microeconomics to study how poor rural populations respond to economic opportunities and constraints, as well as to study conflict and cooperative behavior in a range of settings. We're really lucky to have a few Palestinian academics here with us today. And with that, Professor Ibrahim, please go ahead.
Thank you. You can hear me well? Okay. All right, let me share. I have some slides. And I will start timing myself. 15 minutes, I believe. Okay, so thank you everybody for being here. Really the first part of at least the presentations that I'm responsible for is meant to really locate this genocidal moment in its historical context. In its settler colonialist context, I'm going to speak about that for some time, talk about the role of the British mandate in where we are today, both politically and economically, and finally, talk about the post-1967 war. So that was the war when Israel controlled the remainder of Mandate Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, what that meant in terms of what I call economic dependency. This is Rethinking Economics, and we're also interested in putting ideas and theories in conversation as well, and then what that meant in terms of class transformation as well. And so, again, like I mentioned, one of the aims is to put this moment in its historical context. And so we're going to have to go back to the late 19th century when historical Palestine was under the rule of the ailing Ottoman Empire. The population that was living on the land at that time was overwhelmingly Palestinian Arabs, both Muslims and Christians, with a small Jewish minority, right? There was 3–4%. Now, what started to happen, and this is going to be a recurring theme, right? European anti-Semitism is going to be a theme here. In the 1880s, a number of Jews who were fleeing anti-Semitism, mostly in Tsarist Russia, and convinced with newly formed Zionist ideas, immigrated to Palestine and established roughly 20 colonies at that time. During those early migration waves, Zionist organizations sent a fact-finding mission to explore the viability of establishing that state. And so this was one of the quotes from that report. It said, "The bride is beautiful, but she is already married," referring to the Arab population who existed there. In 1917, during World War I, the British government issued what is known as the Balfour Declaration. And this is, I think, really, if you want to start in the 20th century, I think this is a good moment to start thinking about this. So what that declaration did was promise the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, and claiming that the government, the British government, will use their best endeavors to facilitate achievement of this object. Now, keep in mind that at the time of the declaration, the 700,000 Palestinian Arabs still constituted the overwhelming majority, right? The two major waves or aliyahs of European Jewish immigration added up to roughly 50 or 55,000 people only. Now, I want you to know two things, because I'm emphasizing 1917 and this colonial narrative, because 100 years after that, you still have that narrative. So the first thing that I want you to know is that Balfour is not doing this because he's a wonderful human being, okay? Balfour is a racist anti-Semite. Let's be very clear. This is the guy that once said, quote, "White and black races are born with different capacities which education cannot and will not change," okay? This is the guy who talked about the misery that the Jewish people brought to Europe. If you're interested in Balfour, there's a nice piece by Yusuf Munayir in 2017 about Balfour. But the second thing that I want you to know, this is maybe more important, is that Palestinians were referred in that declaration, if you can read it, as the non-Jewish population, right? As the other. So if anybody here, is interested or studies or reads settler colonial mindset, right? It's the other. The Palestinians are the other, even though they were the majority, right? More importantly, even than that, it's referring to their civil and religious rights, never their political rights, right? So again, this is very typical. 100 years later, you can still blatantly see that Western, at least governments and powers, for them, Palestinians who are the natives are never looked at equally. So indeed, since that declaration, and particularly after the imposition of the British mandate that we're going to talk about, Jewish immigration accelerated. This, of course, would intensify further following the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So this picture is actually from London, reading, "You must save the lives of Jewish people in Germany. Sign the petition for increased immigration to Palestine," right? Not to Britain, not to the US, not to other places. Push them to Palestine. And so a lot of people sometimes, well, maybe in the US more than other places, when I start talking about Israel as a settler colonial state, they get, it's weird for them. And I'm like, I get it. Okay, settler colonialism has a bad rep nowadays. I understand that. You don't like, if you're a supporter of Israel, that we talk about Israel as settler colonial state. But keep in mind, this is exactly how the early Zionist leaders thought about immigration to Palestine. So let's start with Theodore Herzl, right? He's saying we should therefore form a part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe which would have to guarantee our existence. European colonialism, 50, 60 years after, the head of the Jewish colonization department, we'll come back to the names in a second. He's saying there's no room for both peoples, right? The only solution is without the Arabs. There is no other way but to transfer all of them. And look what's happening now in Rafah, all around in Gaza, all around the West Bank. There's no other way but to transfer all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left. Netanyahu 2024. This is a war of, again, civilization against barbarism. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but if you are interested, the only thing that I would want you to read of all those quotes is the Iron Wall from Jabotinsky in 1923. I'm going to read only one of these quotes, but they're very telling. So let's start with that last one. I think I'm going to read just the last one. So it says, "We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them palatable, but they know what we want as well as we know what they don't want. They feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico in their Sioux for their rolling prairies." And again, you can go on and on and on about this. But it's not just, again, Jabotinsky was the intellectual grandfather of the Likud party, which Netanyahu is the head of today. Netanyahu's father worked very closely with Jabotinsky. So, this is not somebody that's on the fringe of Zionist history and leaders. But it wasn't just kind of that rhetoric. I mean, even the names, if you look at the Zionist organizations that were operating in Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel, right? The Jewish Colonization Association. If you look on that right-hand side, it says the Jewish Colonial Trust. This would later be the first bank in Israel. But these Zionist organizations actually, together with the British Mandate that we're going to talk about in a sec, they really started the transformation at that time of the Palestinian economy by distorting the various markets, let's say, in Palestine. So first, land, right? Land prices were distorted because the Jewish National Fund was able to pay prices way above the local market price. And when the Jewish National Fund bought land, it now became owned by the Jewish people of the world. So that basically effectively removed it and removed that land of those plots from the market completely. Now, that substantial increase in demand for land by the Zionist organizations led to the commodification of land. Again, at that time, that phenomena was almost foreign to Palestinians. The second point is capital, right? So capital from donations and grants was distributed according to political considerations rather than the most profitable project. Labor, right? If you needed to work, as long as you were part of the Israeli Histadrut, as long as you were Jewish, you were able to find a job, you were able to find employment. Not if you were Palestinian, if you were Arab, Palestinian, Christian, or Muslim. And so this is kind of the start of the transformation that is happening. The British Mandate comes. And on the one hand, right, politically, it's facilitating Jewish immigration. It's facilitating the acquisition of citizenship, right? That same law that they had was used to deny nationality to Palestinians, but to give citizenship to the Jewish people of the world. And again, even though it was a minority at the time, it gave the Jewish agency this governmental status. But maybe from the part that I'm more interested in economically, the British Mandate deliberately facilitated growth in Jewish industry and imposed policies that would facilitate, really, the proletarianization of Palestinians, stripping them from their lands. So first, it was the idea of agriculture taxes, which existed, right, under the Ottoman Empire. But taxes under the Mandate were acquired in cash, not in kind, which drove a lot of peasants into debt, money borrowing with higher interest, and they basically then had to leave that. Second, the very first economic concessions of very important vital projects in Palestine, including the Rothenburg Electricity Company, the Atlit Salt Company, the Palestine Potash Company, all of those were given for Jewish businessmen only, right? So what you're doing is basically concentrating slowly income and wealth in the hand of a minority Jewish population and Jewish businesses at that time. Tariffs and the open doors was very important. So this is very interesting. The Mandate administration abolished export tariffs on Jewish manufactured goods and any import tariffs on the raw material that they required, while imposing high import tariffs on final goods that might compete with Jewish industries. In terms of Arab industries, what they did, right, they would have high tariffs, let's say, so they would have high tariffs on cement, on chemicals, that was the Jewish industries, while there were no tariffs on olive oil and soap, which was the Arab industries. So it's not a surprise that at the time of the partition plan, and that's what you see on the left-hand side, more than 25 years after the imposition of the mandate, the weight of the Jewish economy became stronger. So this is comparing between 1917 and 1947, not just in terms of the population, but in terms of production, in terms of output, in terms of the level of the economy. See that shift on the right-hand side, Jewish production from 19% to 53% of output of economic activity, that transformation that happened that time. And by the way, that table doesn't even tell the whole story. By 1947, the Jewish share of manufacturing, of industrial production, right, productive sectors that are very important in economics, was 89%. So this gives you an idea. And so that 1947 partition plan, which you see on the left-hand side, suggested a Jewish state on 57% of the land of Palestine, despite only forming 35% of the population and only owning actually 8% of that land. And so obviously, this was faced by opposition, revolt from Palestinians. The state of Israel was established, and then Jewish militias, including the Haganah, the Irgun, the Lehi, and others, committed 70 documented massacres that eventually led to the exodus of 80% of the population that was living at that time. And so what you see on the right-hand side is then later the green line, or the post-1948 map. So you can, this is a great book. Ilan Pappé is considered one of these new Israeli historians, Avi Shleim and others, who really have access to material from the archives and have been writing on what happened in 1948. And so what happened in 1948 is that those 700 or so thousand Palestinians had to leave what later became the state of Israel, went to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip. And I think if you want to come back in the Q&A about this, there's a very important aspect, right? 80% of the population in Gaza are actually refugees from 1948. So this is something that we can talk about. So the last really section that I want to talk about is post-1967. So this is kind of the part where we talk about, let's start by thinking about investment at what was happening at that time in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So there's this famous report in 1991, the Israeli Sedan report, that clearly said that there was no priority that was given to the promotion of local businesses. And basically what was done was to get by military orders that closed all the banks, that made it very difficult for Palestinians to do business, by the confiscation of land. What you had is this class transformation. So what you see on the left-hand side is two scales, right? On the one hand, you see the percentage of wage labor. So you basically had a transformation of people who were self-employed in agriculture to become wage workers, mostly in construction, but in the Israeli economy. And what happened was so you're seeing the transformation from self-employed to wage labor as you have more and more Palestinians working in Israel. So this created a deep dependency on the labor market that would remain entrenched until today. And so this labor served Israel in a multitude of ways. I'll kind of end with this by talking a little bit about this in export, but I do want to mention this because this is really important. The introduction of a new pool of cheap surplus labor, right, low wages, low benefits, really curtailed wage inflation, and it ensured a steady profit for Israeli enterprises. Second, Palestinian workers were vulnerable to repression, unfair treatment, right? This is a quote from the Var newspaper. It says, it's almost impossible to fire an Israeli worker, while for the Arab, he's exceptionally mobile. He or she can be dismissed without notice and moved from place to place. They do not strike. They do not present demands. And then finally, obviously, you can think of these people as this latent reserve army of labor that was utilized to also quell conflict between Israeli capital and Israeli labor. So that means suppressing the bargaining power of Jewish labor at times of recessions and then allowing for social mobility at times of growth. What you see on the left-hand side is how the unemployment rate is compared to the possibility of work in Israel. The added benefit for Israel of having all these Palestinian workers is that they have income. But if you couple income with the fact that there is no productive sectors, that means that the vast majority of what Palestinians will spend their money on will end up being Israeli products. And so you have an increase in the trade deficit, while 70 to 80% of trade is with Israel. And so the final maybe point, I said final before I know, but really the final point is just to try to also locate this theoretically, right? We're thinking about rethinking economics. And so the mainstream neoclassical economics, normally it talks about convergence, right? It says, hey, if you have proximity between these two economies, one strong, one poor, you'll have a dispersion of positive effects on the smaller economy. And you know, I can talk a little bit about my work later, but at least part of my work focuses on looking at Palestine through this dependency framework and lens, where what happens is you have a poor periphery economy, right? It exports raw material, you know, very light manufactured goods and labor, and it imports final goods from that strong economy. So that poor economy is unable to develop a productive base. Its trade deficit skyrockets, and then it remains dependent. What that means for the rich economy is they're allowed to plunder the natural resources of that periphery. They make use of that reserve army that we saw before, and it obviously opens up that periphery's market to the goods that it can have. So there's no, from a Marxist perspective, there's no overproduction crisis, and firms can sell all their commodities. Now, this kind of is linked then later to supposedly institutional change in the late in the early 1990s. With the Oslo Accord, you have the establishment of the PA, and very little happens economically. A lot of the dependency remains entrenched. It just becomes codified through some agreements. And I know Professor Ahmad is going to talk a little bit more about that, you know, not just from an economic perspective, but mostly from kind of this political aspect, strategic political aspect on what happened after the 1990s. So I'll end here. Thank you for bearing with me. There's a lot of stuff that I went through quickly, but I'm happy to talk. I'm happy that there's a sufficient time for us to discuss this or other points that you're interested in about what's going on.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for being here. It's really good to be with you. And thank you to Rethinking Economics for inviting me. I actually won't have slides. I'm just going to go the old-fashioned way of just talking. We only have a limited time to talk today so that we can open up the floor for questions. And so in that limited amount of time that I have, I won't be focusing on a particular issue in the political economy of Palestine, but rather I will present a framework that I think might be particularly helpful for how we can systematically structure our thinking about the trajectory of oppression and apartheid in Palestine. And that framework is one that I will call one of strategic objectives and strategy. Okay, so what I'm going to do basically in this time is three things. First, I'll briefly clarify what I mean by such a framework. Second, I'll link it back to Israel-Palestine and explain how it can be helpful for us to analyze the general trajectory of oppression, also focusing on the post-Oslo period. And third, I'll touch on how it can be helpful for understanding how we got to October 7th and where we are today and where we may be going forward. Okay. So first, let me clarify what I mean by a framework focusing on strategic objectives and strategy. Now, if you look up the word strategic online, then in the dictionary, you're going to get that it means, quote, relating to the identification of long-term or overall aims and the means of achieving these aims, end quote. Okay, so basically, if something is a strategic objective, say of the Israeli state, then that's very, very important to that entity, and it will change quite little or not much with time or at very great cost or difficulty. Okay, while strategy is the plan of action designed to achieve this long-term aim. And furthermore, a strategy itself may be composed of smaller and potentially fluid and changing tactics. Now here, I'll go through three brief points. First, when we talk about consensus or disagreement, we need to be talking about what level. Is there consensus or disagreement about general objectives or about strategies or tactics? Because you may have a situation, and I'll talk about this in the case of Israel, where there is actually consensus about a broader strategic objective, even if there is disagreement within a certain entity about the tactics or strategy to achieve this objective. Okay. Second, in pursuit of a general strategic priority or objective, what will be deemed a feasible or best strategy to achieve it, if that objective is at all achievable, will depend, of course, in part on interaction with others who also have stake in this issue and who may have their own conflicting long-term aims around this. So, for example, in a situation of conflicting strategic objectives, like if one entity wants to occupy all the land at the expense of another entity, then that former entity will have to think not only about what it wants in terms of its strategic priorities, but how the opponent would respond to a particular plan or strategy and how it can best dilute the opponent's ability to oppose or block its plan. And therefore here, third, power will really matter. Because a more powerful entity, which faces a weaker opponent, will be more able to push through a certain strategic plan, ward off or crush opposition, and achieve its strategic objective, and the opposite is true if it's relatively weaker. And so in a situation of conflicting strategic interests, the balance of power may tell us who is likely to be able to force the other to acquiesce to their own objective. And of course, this is really important that in the real world, the balance of power may shift over time as well, rendering a previously tenable strategy for an achievable objective no longer a tenable strategy for what has become a no longer achievable objective. Okay, so that's kind of the broad idea of this framework that I want to talk about. And now let's kind of link this back to Israel-Palestine. To see how assumptions about strategic objectives and strategies are key to inform our understanding, I think it's helpful to step back a little bit in time. Ibrahim has provided a wonderful overview for us, and we kind of leave off in the 90s. So I'll actually talk about the Oslo Peace Accords of 1993. This is where I'm going to start. Now, as many of you know, these accords were brokered by the United States, and it was basically an agreement which promised a sovereign Palestinian state within 5 years. So by 1998, with Israel withdrawing from the occupied territories or the territories that it occupied in 1967 in exchange for Palestinians meeting particular Israeli security demands. And this is known as the land for peace paradigm, because essentially the idea is that Israel would withdraw from these territories that it occupied, so it would give back land in return for peaceful relations with the Palestinians. And that was basically the strategic framework for what became known as the two-state solution. Okay. Now, why do underlying strategic interests matter here when we're talking about something like the Oslo Accords? Well, they definitely matter because the Accords, like most other international agreements between state or state-like actors, do not have a supranational enforcer. So what that means is that they will only succeed via self-enforcement by both parties, both concerned parties, and so this will actually only happen if the goals of the Accords also align with the long-term incentives and objectives of the parties involved. And this was actually exactly the underlying, if unspoken, premise of the Oslo Peace Accords. And particularly the key assumption underpinning them was that Israel is interested in a land for peace deal from a strategic perspective, as are the Palestinians. And this wasn't on a naive sort of presupposition that Israel just, from the goodness of its heart wants to withdraw from the occupied territories. Rather, the assumption was that, okay, Israel maybe derives some value from the occupied territory in whatever strategic vision it has, but the strain in terms of the security relations, and maybe it is compromised in terms of its security with the Palestinians. And so if withdrawal can help Israel guarantee its security, then withdrawal is more valuable from a strategic point of view than indefinite occupation and settlement. Okay, so that was the underlying premise of the Oslo Accords. Now, of course, the Accords were not self-enforced, because if they were, we would now be celebrating the 25th anniversary of a sovereign Palestinian state. So then, of course, the question naturally arises, which is, where did the strategic assessment that I just spoke about go wrong? Now, in the West, in the USA and Europe, there's been a predominant narrative until recently, or maybe including until now in some parts, which is that Israel has been strategically interested in a land for peace deal, but the Palestinians, or at least important fractions within the Palestinians, have not. Instead, for some reason, the Palestinians are wired towards always being violent, and this, choosing violence as a dominant strategy, prevents Israel from withdrawing. Okay, so the idea is, okay, Israel would love to withdraw, but it's not going to get peace anyway, so why would it even withdraw? And this type of narrative has been really pervasive, and it's been reinforced and propagandized by the Israeli state very cleverly by always stressing its security paradigm, always saying leaving the occupied territories is a security risk for us, and that's why we don't leave. Okay. Now, of course, this interpretation of where the strategic assessment went wrong and placing it on the shoulder of the Palestinians falls into some huge problems, in addition to just being quite racist and seeing Palestinians as constantly violent barbarians, of course. And one of the problems this narrative faces is it can't explain why Palestinians would resort to violence as a dominant strategy when a state would have been otherwise on offer, when they were already struggling in the 5 years post-Oslo Accords to secure a state. So they were already in a weak bargaining power position. Why weaken it even more? The second issue it can't explain is why in the territories where militant action was largely crushed and suppressed, like in the West Bank, those territories never saw any withdrawal, and actually they just saw expansion of settlements. So that narrative cannot explain that. And just more broadly, the interest in any conflict of the more powerful party will usually determine the trajectory of the conflict. And so in what way can we say that the Palestinians have overpowered the will of the Israelis in how this conflict is going? Okay. Now, if this narrative does not hold water, which it does not, then of course the other explanation, logically, is that Israel's strategic interests do not lie within withdrawal and in a land for peace agreement, and that actually they lie within something quite different. And this is, in fact, as many of us know by now, exactly the case, not just historically, but also in this current period. And so here I will just briefly mention what appeared to me to be A, where the strategic interests of the Zionist national project lie, as we've seen in the past few decades. B, what strategies have been used by Zionists to achieve those objectives. And finally, where this leaves us today. Now, to best gauge the strategic interests or objectives of any entity in any context, it's usually not very useful to look at actions that can be construed as cheap talk. So these are actions that you can say, okay, I'm going to do it, but then if you don't do it, there are absolutely no consequences or costs. And signing an agreement like the Oslo Accords, which is not binding and doesn't have any consequences for not going through what you said, is something like cheap talk. So just looking at, okay, Israel signed the Oslo Accords, so that's a good arbiter of its interests, it's not. What is a good arbiter of strategic interests are things that are very costly actions and investments that are difficult to reverse and which create and lock in particular realities on the ground. Because basically, if you're investing a lot of time and energy and money into creating something which is irreversible and likely to be permanent, right, then we can safely think that you think this is a good thing for you. Okay. Now, of course, for this reason, the absolute most credible arbiter of the strategic priorities of the Israeli state are settlements and settlement construction. Now, we know, as Ibrahim, of course, highlighted, that the Zionist settlement project, which erected the state of Israel through the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinians in 1948, that this settlement project continued in the territories that then Israel occupied in 1967. And actually, if you look at a graph of settlement number growth in the occupied territories, you'll see two striking things. First, we have really a very high growth in the number of settlers over the last 50 years. So it started with a few thousand in 1967, and today we're at 850,000 settlers, sitting on 40% of the land of the occupied territory. So that's number one. But number two, which is actually, I think, even more interesting, is the fact that if you look at the growth, it's almost a straight line. It does not fall with some governments and then increase with other governments. This is not contingent on a left or right-wing government in Israel being in power, all right? So basically, what the trajectory of settlements shows us are two clear things. First, it reflects that expansion and not withdrawal have been the effective strategic priority of the Israeli state over the last 50 years. And second, it shows that there's been consensus around this as a strategic objective, regardless of which party has been in power in Israel. And this is important because today, you'll hear a lot of, oh, the problem is, Netanyahu's right-wing government and the most right-wing government in the history of Israel. Yes, this may create some differences within local Israeli politics, but it's nonsense when it comes to Palestine, because when it comes to Palestinians, all Israeli governments, and we should remember that these are democratically elected, so they also reflect Israeli society sentiment, they've all been expansionist, without exception, okay? Where they have disagreed have been on the strategies and tactics that are best to be used in line with this greater strategic priority, and particularly on how and what form Palestinian limited self-administration over the Bantustans in which Palestinians live can take. That's really been the point of disagreement. But real Palestinian sovereignty, as can only emerge, let's say on the 1967 lines, from withdrawal of the settlements and Palestinian control over the borders, has always been out of the question by all Israeli governments. And this is actually not a secret, because you can read frank expressions of this in internal Israeli dialogue, including by the one leader who's been, heralded as the peace guy in Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the Oslo Peace Accords, and who actually, you can read public things he said in the Knesset, being very frank that Israel will not accept the sovereign state, that the Oslo Accords are only for limited self-administration. Israel will absolutely never remove a single settlement and will only continue to grow and renew settlements. Okay, so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, one state with equal rights for everybody that lives in Greater Palestine or Israel has also been always out of the question. And so effectively what we have is that Israel's strategic endeavors have always coalesced around continued expansion and what amounts to a no-state solution for the Palestinian people, with, of course, also the continued expansion making a state impossible, so also serving that strategic objective. Now, the thing that I want to move to now is what kind of logic underlies this continued interest in expansion and in the no-state solution, and particularly how can we understand what we've been told is a security dilemma, right? Because remember, Israel, the assumptions underpinning the accords and the thing that Israel's always said is there's a security dilemma and Israel is strategically interested in land for peace, pending that Palestinians meet security concerns, right? And this we've seen has been false. Israel has not seen withdrawal as imperative for its security. And actually, this is also something which is not a secret, because Israeli leaders openly talk about this. Not only do Israeli leaders not say that withdrawal is important for the security of the Israeli state, they actually say that expansion is important for the security of the Israeli state. This is all also quite public. And so how can we understand this idea that withdrawal is not necessarily and actually potentially even harmful from Israel's point of view for its own security? I think we need to address this and to really understand what this logic means and where it comes from by understanding that there are two separate types of security that are referred to, and breaking down why withdrawal is not seen by Israel as either strategically necessary or even advisable. The first is a type of physical security, and the second is a more problematic type of demographic security. Okay, and I'll talk about each of these. When it comes to physical security, the key is that Israel has not felt the need to withdraw to keep itself secure because it has had the power, backed and chiefly enabled by the United States, to pursue another kind of strategy to ensure its security. That's less costly for it than withdrawal, but that's really extremely costly and horrific to the Palestinian people. And that's one where, it partly relies on security collaboration with a local authority, the Palestinian Authority that was created in the Oslo Accords, But more importantly, where the Israeli state threatens and enacts horrific retaliation on civilian population centers from where any kind of opposition to the occupation emerges. So the idea is basically that this type of state terror can be unleashed at asymmetric levels on civilian populations, and that is enough to mute any opposition to Israeli strategy. No withdrawal is needed because any opponent would fear the massive extent of retaliation. And in fact, this notion that asymmetric warfare on civilian populations acts as deterrence and is sufficient for deterrence has been codified explicitly in something called the Dahiya Doctrine of the Israeli Defense Forces in 2006. So again, you can read about this online, okay? So just to sum up what I've said so far, for Israel, it's clear that until recently, the no-state solution had not in its eyes endangered physical security to the extent that would make withdrawal imperative. In fact, because there's this idea of asymmetric warfare on civilian populations as deterrence. Moreover, and this is important, it is plausible that the no-state solution has actually contributed to a more insidious type of demographic security for Israel. And here we must understand that the priorities of the Zionist national project lie not just in having a majority of Jewish people in the area of historic Palestine, but very importantly, in maintaining preferential rights for Jews within the area of historic Palestine or Israel. Now, while a Palestinian state would help to reduce the number of non-Jews in the areas directly controlled by Israel, because now some of these Palestinians would have their own state, it's actually not clear that this would help uphold the system of preferential rights for Jews versus non-Jews in Israel, which again is integral to Zionism. And why do I say this? I say this because, as you know, Palestinians don't just exist in the occupied territories. There are also Palestinian citizens of Israel, second-class citizens, but they live in Israel. And there's also millions of diaspora refugees who have an internationally recognized right to return. Okay? Now, these Palestinians, it's not clear that they would accept transfers to a state in the occupied territories, like let's say in 1967, if it were to emerge. And in fact, they may even be emboldened to demand equal rights of citizenship and to demand their internationally recognized right of return to their actual homelands if such a state were to emerge. Now, we can speculate about what different Palestinians would or would not accept, but the point is that for the Zionist project, it is just not clear that preferential rights for Jews in Israel can be guaranteed through conceding rights to pockets of indigenous Palestinians. And actually, the system of preferential rights may be undermined by conceding rights to pockets of Palestinians. And in that case, the Palestinian problem for Israel, from a preferential rights perspective, would have no solution except basically permanent containment. So to sum up, Israel as an occupying power has basically pursued an objective not of two states, operationalized with a strategy of withdrawal and land for peace, but a strategic objective of maintaining a system of preferential rights, operationalized through a strategy of settlement expansion, therefore a no-state solution, and what we can call peace for peace instead of land for peace. Now, peace for peace sounds nice, but it's actually quite horrific, because that's exactly what I was referring to earlier, where Palestinians are offered neither withdrawal, so land, nor equal rights in exchange for Israel's peace, but rather a peace in which they are spared from massive Israeli bombing and now starvation campaigns. And it is this threat of hugely asymmetric attacks on civilians which is used to guarantee Israel's tranquility and normal life as it maintains its occupation and system of preferential rights, and of course, as it enacts the lower intensity, everyday violence of segregation on the Palestinians. Finally, this brings us to October 7th, right? Basically, what the October 7th attack did was it signified that the threat and exercise of asymmetric Israeli military power on civilian populations may no longer be sufficient as a deterrent to keep Israel secure if Israel is unwilling to cede a political solution, the no-state solution being an unacceptable one to Palestinians. Okay? So therefore, October 7th can actually also be understood within the strategic framework as a violent strategy on behalf of particular Palestinian factions to challenge Israel's no-state and peace for peace doctrine to perhaps the greatest extent since 1948. And of course, with the backdrop that prior negotiations, which were based on the land for peace paradigm, had proven ill-suited for such a challenge, given that they were based on false premises. Okay? Now, on the Israeli side, it's also precisely because the 7th of October challenged the foundational assumption under which the state has operated, which is that it can expand in perpetuity and it can contain Palestinians in perpetuity without impacting its own security, that the attack was viewed as a strategic threat of the highest order. And that's also where Israel's unprecedented levels of retaliation against the civilian Palestinian population of Gaza have come in. Yes, partly as revenge, but also largely as a brutal attempt to reinforce the prevailing security doctrine. So now Israel is saying that it can threaten not just to bomb population centers and mass murder as it had done in 2008, 2014, 2021 in Gaza, in places from where militants emerged, or to raid and arrest and assassinate as it has done for a long time in the West Bank, but now it can also credibly threaten to raise entire cities, commit genocide against entire communities, and starve populations in an attempt to restore this doctrine of terrorizing civilian populations as deterrence while it continues to pursue its strategic objectives. Okay, now finally, of course, Israel refuses to acknowledge and address the political roots of the problem, which is its insistence on preferential rights for the populations under its control, this colonial mentality that Ibrahim was just talking about, and Palestinian opposition to this permanent containment. And so the options for the Israeli state basically amount to further war crimes involving ethnic cleansing and annihilation of Palestinian communities, while in the long term, Palestinian endurance and resistance are unlikely to cease without an end to the repression. So basically what we have is a vicious and ultimately untenable colonial approach and apartheid strategy, but one which, until it is dismantled, will be inflicting huge, devastating, and genocidal proportions kind of suffering on the Palestinian people, particularly right now, of course, in Gaza. And finally, I want to end here on a note, which is that everything that's been done in opposition to the genocide since October 7th, including the student protests in the US and Europe, have been very, very important, not just because they raise awareness about Palestine and advocacy for the Palestinian people, but precisely because they accelerate the extent to which Israeli commitment to preferential rights, to apartheid, and to the horrific strategies that sustain this vision, they accelerate the extent to which this commitment will become untenable to both Israeli state and society, because they accelerate the costs internationally for Israel of continuing to go down this route. And this, in my mind, I think, is one of the best ways to advocate for justice for the Palestinian people and for a free Palestine. And I'll stop there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that from both of you. That was really insightful to learn. I think it was good how we got to see a kind of macroeconomic perspective as well as a microeconomic perspective. So we'll now be moving on to questions from the audience mostly. For everyone to see, there's a Q&A box on the bottom right, so it's separate from the chat. You can give your comments and reflections in the chat, but if you want a question to be answered by the panelists, please put it into the Q&A section. Also, at Rethink, we really value curiosity and courage, but at the same time, let's please be careful about the words we're using and approach this with no prejudice and discrimination. Thank you. To start with, we have a question from Amal, who's one of the organizers for the event today from Rethink South Africa. For Professor Shikaki, using the dependency framework, would you classify Israel as being part of the core due to its existence as a USA client state and Palestine forming part of the periphery? Furthermore, what implications does that have on how we try to disrupt the functioning of the Israeli economy?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, I think, is yes. I think maybe more interestingly is why. And for me, the reason is because I want, and a lot of people who write about the political economy of Palestine want to negate this notion of economic peace. And so again, all of these things are connected. Mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, neoliberal economic policy, together with this idea of convergence, right? So this idea of economic peace, all you need to do is put these Palestinian and Israeli business people together, you know, the profits and everything, it's going to make things better. The Palestinians are going to make use of all the technology, et cetera, et cetera. But what you see in reality, right? I mean, we've had some time to see is that, right? It's the opposite. This something similar to what Ha-Joon Chang talks about, kicking away the ladder, or what Eric Reiner talks about, why rich countries are rich and how rich countries got rich and why poor countries remain poor. What you have actually is a divergence, and the main reason for that happens to be that our economic system, I tell my students sometimes, is called capitalism and not laborism. So if you think between capital and labor, which side is going to be the one that is going to be on top? It's going to be capital. So the Israeli-Palestinian economic relations are relations between Israeli capital and Palestinian labor. And that's why sometimes talking about South Africa, a lot of times in my writings, I say South Africa should be a warning, actually, for Palestinians. I say, you know what? If somehow, sometime in the next 50 years, 100 years, I don't know when, if we reach a political resolution, right, that is not going to be sufficient for Palestine and Israel. Definitely not for Palestinians. Because in the 1990s, South Africa rid itself from political apartheid, but economic apartheid still exists, right? South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. 10% of the population, surprise, surprise, the white South Africans, are owning 90% of the income and wealth in that country. And so I think it's very important, even for the rhetoric and the narrative, that core periphery helps, I think, in that sense. In terms of the impact, there is still obviously no economic solution for a political problem, and this is a political issue, obviously. But I think it's also important to, this is maybe going to make things even bleaker. Even what we call the domestic or Palestinian economy, that's also very much reliant on the Israeli economy. And I'll give you just one example, right? Subcontracting. Actually, there's a gendered element to this. There's a wonderful article in the 1970s by Amal in MERIP, the Middle East Research and Information Project. When after 1967, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip kind of opened up to the higher Israeli price level, Palestinian families, right? The working families had to have one more breadwinner, and the majority of women at that time were not working because a big part of it has to do because they didn't have access to agriculture anymore where they were working because of the confiscation of land. But what that meant is that you had to have more income for Palestinians for them to be able to cope with that price increase. And what Israeli producers did was work with Palestinian capitalists. And again, one of the reasons why I like this dependency approach is because it talks to us about the comprador. It talks to us about a class within the periphery that has their interests aligned with that in the core. And so what they did is they set up basically these sweatshops around Palestinian cities, including, my own Tulkarem, which is very close to the Green Line in the West Bank, where you basically had Palestinian women paid very, very low wages. Israelis would bring the capital, mostly in textile. Palestinian women would work, and they would send it back. So even and I have something on Al-Shabaka about trade services, the vast majority of economic activities that exist in the Palestinian economy are actually also those related to the Israeli economy. So it is very difficult at this stage to think about kind of small piecemeal kind of strategies. You can, if you're thinking about steadfastness, sumud, or resistance economics, but not in terms of development. There can be no economic development under occupation. It will need to be kind of economic resistance, political resistance, military resistance, whatever diplomatic resistance you want to put them, and that will be the start. But without really that autonomy, without that control over resources or policies or currency, then it's difficult to think about something that's long-lasting.
Thank you very much for that. I think especially when you say that it is difficult to conceptualize an answer to a political problem through economics, that resonates with all of us, unfortunately. Along similar lines, we have another question in the chat, which is, are there any successful grassroots economic initiatives or cooperatives in Palestine that could serve as a model for broader economic development?
Amal, I can start, and then if you wanted to add, I mean, there have been there have been some instances, but again, as a macroeconomist, I have to look back, right? I mean, first of all, you of course realize that the Palestinian economy is a very strong economy, normally a small economy. Normally, small economies are very open, sort of very reliant on the external sector. And again, because you don't have any control over borders, whether you're thinking about importing machinery or raw material, or obviously exporting your goods, there's a lot of limitation on that. The second thing, though, is that a lot of these cooperatives and some examples are agricultural. And, Amal was talking about this even within the West Bank, right? Because the Gaza Strip is like 60 kilometers times 5. Even within the West Bank, right, the vast majority, 60% of that land that is considered Area C, which is under completely Israeli control, that is the land where the most fertile kind of Palestinian, the Jordan Valley, which is on the border and other parts, that's the most fertile land, aside from obviously what is now Israel. That was also the fertile land that existed there. So even these do not have, like, if you think about kind of like potential for the future. I think it's important to focus on agriculture at this moment. It's very labor intensive. It can help in kind of that steadfastness economics that we're talking about, probably not kind of that long-term project. And one thing that I will mention, I have one of my students here, and she's working with me in the summer on thinking about the future. It's very difficult nowadays, obviously, but thinking about Gaza and thinking about the future and thinking about the various different kind of reconstruction processes that happened after 2008, 2009, after 2014, some of the mistakes that happened there. And one idea that we're thinking about is kind of talking more about worker-owned enterprises as a way that kind of just does not kind of continue this capital versus labor, capitalistic type of relation, but thinking of something that is more equitable, at least in the short run when we're thinking about that. So that's what I would say. Like a lot of these, you could find examples, you can find some great ideas, but when it comes to kind of the resources that you have, when it comes to control that you have, then kind of the prospects for those become weaker.
Amal, would you like to add to that?
Ibrahim answered wonderfully. I would just add that the issue of, I just be careful about the issue of broader economic development in Palestine, while the political structure is the same. Because like Ibrahim said, there are no economic solutions to political problems. And economic development, yes, it is economic, but it also has political prerequisites. And being part of some fiscal state, whether part of an Israeli fiscal state or a sovereign Palestinian fiscal state, that is a prerequisite for the ability to develop an economy. And so while we're in this no state solution, I think any measures are more stopgap measures, and they're also measures to ensure the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, to allow Palestinians to remain in Palestine, to resist in Palestine, but it's not going to be really a model for real structural economic transformation, because the political prerequisites for that are political liberation. And so it's political liberation first, economic development second, I think. And that's why this whole thing that we get sold sometimes of economic peace, it doesn't exist. That's not a thing. Yeah. So that's just what I wanted to add to that.
I think that was a very important contribution to it. What about when we consider, yes, there needs to be political liberation before economic development, but if you can kind of reverse engineer it, what about the economic basis for liberation, perhaps such as the BDS movement? That's been a lot of discussion now, especially with student protests. Do you think this far, sorry, I'm just putting my own question in now. Do you think this far into the genocide, the smaller scale boycotts can still play a role? Of course, they can still play a symbolic role, but do you think there's a tangible impact on the Israeli system that comes from them, or is social pressure for large-scale sanctions the only possible route out?
I personally think that these efforts are very, very important, but I think not so much for the economic pressure they exert, because maybe a lot of these funds maybe don't add up to very much of the giant Israeli economy. I think where they really matter is the political pressure. So yes, they exert some economic cost, but I think they exert much, much higher political cost. They exert much higher reputational cost. And that's very damaging to Israel and to its economy in the long run, because if it's treated as a pariah apartheid state, that will definitely have very serious economic repercussions in the long run. So I think it is through their political impact and their reputational impact that they may also lead to a real economic impact, not so much in the direct sort of like finance right now. That's my opinion, but so that they are hugely, hugely important, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I'd add to that. I 100% completely agree with Amal on that point. I would divide our discussion about boycott into two parts, though. One part is kind of that external view, and that is very important. You know, Amal mentioned in her talk about the cost, right? How costly is it going to be for Israel? And that increases the cost from a strategic point of view. And absolutely, I mean, I remember when I used to live in the West Bank, I used to work with the Scandinavian NGO, and we would bring kind of the owners, the consultants for these Scandinavian wealth funds, right? Very, very rich people. And we would take them to the settlements and the Israeli settlements to talk about how a lot of their, let's say, Swedish or Norwegian companies are violating international law and calling for them to boycott, etc. So, you know, regardless of the size and you know, it's not going to cut off the Israeli economy like the one in South Africa did. But my point is there's another part of boycott that's internal, right? And that's for Palestinians. And I think, again, that's where kind of this internal conflict that we don't like to talk about a lot, right? Who are the people who own the licenses to import Israeli products into the West Bank or into the Gaza Strip, right? There are Palestinian business people who are very close to the Palestinian Authority, who are kind of very high up in that, you know, national movement, if you want. And so part of it is obviously Palestinians saying, okay, there are certain things that we can't, you know, not have electricity or water that we do buy from Israel. But, you know, maybe there are certain types of ice cream that we don't need to have in Palestine that is Israeli ice cream. But then who are the people who are still benefiting? And I think, again, that comes to that labor capital conflict that you have within Palestine. That's where kind of this discussion of dependency recognizes that there are classes, that there are groups within the oppressed that do have interests aligned with the Israeli occupation. So I think we can think about them kind of separately. One kind of directed more to kind of what is happening externally, but internally, I think something that can kind of work in terms of strengthening local production, at least for lightly manufactured things like food, lightly manufacturing food stuff and things that are kind of low, let's say, low level production that we have the capability, low capital, low value added, that we have the capacity to do, then there is something to do on that front as well.
I think that's one of the more difficult. Sorry, Amal, would you like to add to that?
No.
Okay. I think one of the most difficult, as someone from India, one of the most difficult conversations to have around colonization is about like the internal structures of your country as well that come and play with colonization and who's benefiting from it, and ultimately why those structures stay in place. There's a question from an anonymous attendee in the chat that kind of talks about, like, even when Amal asked her question, she framed it as to treat it as a pariah state. But do you think there is a possibility of getting there? How do you get there when there's silent Arab states and countries like the US are continuing to back Israel?
Well, I think the issue of being a pariah state is not necessarily contingent just on what formal governments are saying and doing, right? It's a popular sentiment. And I think that when we talk about, of course, Arab states, we have to very much differentiate between the position of governments and the 180-degree different position of most Arab populations. And also increasingly, we're seeing also that divergence in the West, in the US and Europe. So I think we really should not discount these movements. And actually, the more that these movements are met with repression and intimidation, this is a sign that they work, okay? If they did not matter, they would not get this amount of brutal reaction. They are working to change things on the ground, to change perspective, and to raise awareness. And I think really the reason I focused on how we think about things strategically is because at this point, one of our battles is raising awareness, is being able to understand very much what is the issue of Palestine about, right? Is this just about states and some conflict over land, or is this colonialism? Is this an apartheid strategy? And these things are fundamental. And so I think a lot of these movements are both raising awareness and creating this really important political pressure, which I have no doubt will have its fruits, but when, nobody exactly can say how and when, but I don't think it should be discounted just because of the formal positions of governments. And to the contrary, these positions show a kind of desperation in failing to sort of propagandize, as they have done, and now resorting just to fear and intimidation and harassment outright of people that speak up. Shloka, I did want to answer one question that someone asked a while back. I just feel bad to keep them waiting. So somebody asked about, very good question, actually. They asked, wouldn't the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt after the Camp David Accords following the Six-Day War be a counterexample of the assertion that land for peace is not a strategy that Israel follows, and is land for peace only with respect to Palestine? I actually think that's an excellent question, because the whole point isn't that Israel just follows this or that as a dogmatic reaction. It's always, the strategy is always about costs and benefits, right? And when it comes to the Sinai Peninsula, it was at that point that the cost of keeping it, particularly after the military defeat of 1973, was really high, right? And also the gains from normalizing with the first Arab country was also very high, from the return of an area that Israel also saw as a buffer zone. This is not, what they think of as necessarily historic Palestine. And so for that reason, we can see that the calculations were different, the power balance was different, and that's why Israel had to withdraw, even though it wasn't its first preference, right? The balance of power, the strategic concerns, the costs to the Israeli state are quite different when it comes to the land of historic Palestine, and also the deeply embedded colonial strategic attachment and prioritization of what they call the land of Judea and Samaria is quite different from the Sinai Peninsula. But I think that question is really excellent because it highlights how strategy works. It's not just a reflex. It really takes into account the existing context and balance of power. So I just kind of wanted to answer that question briefly. Yeah.
Sorry, that question kind of moved to the answers section.
No worries. Yeah.
Building on the previous question about it doesn't have to be formal political opposition to Israel, there's a question in the chat from Jezara Galeski, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, about the United States, Germany, Italy, and several other countries are continuing to provide military support to Israel. What strategic objectives are these countries pursuing by assisting Israel in this manner?
Should I take this?
I mean, you're the expert on this. Obviously, you're going to answer.
So I think the easier question maybe to answer is actually Germany and Italy, because what this genocide has exposed is that most European countries do not actually have a sovereign foreign policy. They are basically vassals of the US when it comes to foreign policy, including on Israel, of course. So as you see nowadays, you'll see this kind of bizarre phenomenon where if the US spokesperson for the US Department of State comes out and says one thing, immediately Germany, Italy, all these other foreign ministers will say exactly the same thing word for word the next day. Okay, so I think Germany also has a complicated history, and part of the historical guilt that they, of course, rightfully feel against their crimes in the past have been instrumentalized by the Israeli state. And so that also makes it quite difficult in Germany to overcome this notion that Zionism is not colonialism. But anyway, so Germany and Italy, I would say foreign policy of a lot of European countries, vassals of US foreign policy. So then the more interesting question becomes, why is the US continuing to do this. And I actually myself listened to a lot of US analysts to try to understand this myself. And I think we have to first agree that there's like a very structural strategic interest involved, because US foreign policy has trended this way since the 1960s, increasingly so. So this is not something which is dependent on a particular president. So there are obviously structural issues that are causing this to be what US administrations, Republican or Democrat, see as the right tool for them politically. One of these issues, structural, may be the Israel lobby, right? So John Mearsheimer has written a great book about this. I don't think this is the only reason, but definitely it is one of these deeply embedded structural reasons that make the US administration thinking of their own political calculus and their own electoral considerations, which is what they care about strategically, see that if they oppose Israel in any significant way, they're out, they're done. AIPAC runs candidates against them. It's very, very powerful. I think that's only one part of the story, but I think people who are experts in US foreign policy might be better able to answer that. But I will say here, just one thing, is that I don't, given the popular movements that are happening in the US, I think that we will not necessarily see the same position for US administrations 10 years from now or maybe 20 years from now, because things are really changing. And now even their electoral support, especially for the Democratic Party, is being affected by the issue of support for Zionism and by Palestine. And so that's another reason why I think the movements happening on the ground right now are so important, because they're also changing the electoral calculus of US administrations. So yeah, these are things which I think will be in flux in the future. Yeah.
It's always good to have a little message of hope. Another question from an anonymous attendee is, how do we achieve and maintain political freedom as the less developed global south, when throughout the genocide, the international institutions we're supposed to look for justice have made it clear that they serve white monopoly capitalist interests? Do we collectively disengage from these institutions or fight for reforming them? Whoever would like to take that.
I can start, although I do feel Amal will be more insightful on this, especially from a political perspective. I would say a little bit of both, maybe less in terms of, the impact that you want to have from within these institutions. But, I look at, the rhetoric and the narrative of the World Bank and the IMF in the 70s and 80s. If you really kind of study a lot of what they say kind of globally and what they say today, and it has changed. The narrative has changed. And part of it, and I think this relates to what Amal was saying, part of it also relates to who are the people who are there. Just like in the US, it is who are the people. It's the younger people. It's people of color. I mean, this is partly, obviously, when I say young and people of color, these are also the people that have not, get like this. I know, but this is the Marxist in me all the time coming, right? It's the people that did not benefit from capitalism, right? The boomers benefited. There was a time, the Goldilocks age in the US, where people benefited from the economic system. They benefited from all the wars that was going on. So they were happy with it. Part of it now is that they're not. Looking what's happening to Gen Z and the people who are not able to find jobs or, sufficiently paid them job, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that, on the one hand, the smaller part might be to recognize, and I don't mean this in a defeatist way, but that recognize that some of these institutions, there can be slow and maybe gradual change. Having said that, I think the vast majority of what should be done, which can actually lead that gradual change to happen quicker, is to have external pressure. And external pressure partly comes through, I'm not sure if disengaging completely, but maybe engaging regionally. I mean, you have a lot of, if you think about what's going on economically around the globe, you also do find that region, aside from BRICS, aside from Russia and China and the rising powers, you also have kind of these regional collections that are working, that are gaining more and more power. And I do think that that might be something for the global south to think about in terms of kind of then not having to deal kind of without any safety net with that core. So I do think that that can be part of it. unfortunately, one of the challenges a lot has to do also, again, I'm talking about class here, is with the elites, right? Is with the education of the elites and where their ideas come from and where their economic ideas come from. And if the vast majority of places, me and Amal come from UMass Amherst and the New School, probably two of 15 places around the world that let you also be exposed to something that's not mainstream or neoclassical economics solely. But if you have the vast majority of the elite in a lot of countries in the global south, I mean, I talk about Palestine first, right? I mean, Salam Fayyad, our prime minister during the neoliberal era, worked at the World Bank, he worked at the IMF, he studied in the US, and he was a banker. I mean, what more do you want in terms of economic policies staying the same and not being able to get out of that shell? So I do think that there's more to do in terms of, what the person called kind of disengagement, but I would say more engagement kind of in terms of, obviously in terms of regions, but something that I'm also personally interested in is also like more in terms of having more critical, institutions and research centers in academia and slowly impacting policy through connections, so I'm trying to find something that's kind of like a network for heterodox Palestinian and Arab economists, things like that can impact our economics department, our policymakers, our research. And that, again, slowly with time might be able to kind of put a little bit more pressure and help us in kind of bridging the gap that exists there.
Amal, would you like to add to that? Okay. We have another question from Ross, who's one of the organizers as well, who's basically organized all of it. Thank you, Ross. When we come back to the internal politics of Palestine, how perhaps the Palestinian Authority has responded to or even supported the economic dependency that is present now?
I have some things to say about that. Can I go on that? Can I actually share real quickly something that I have? Okay. So just to talk about that, can people see at least the slide that's there? Right. So this is what happened after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Not only did the same dependencies exist, but then you have new dependencies. So the first dependency is on international aid, right? Israel, de facto at least, not de jure, right? De facto says, okay, Palestinian people are not our responsibility, right? After 1993-94, they say, all right, so you have to pay for the education and your health, while under international law, it is the role of the occupying power to ensure the welfare of those under occupation. But they say, no, it's your job now. Okay, so they give the responsibility to the Palestinian Authority, but they don't give any of the resources to the Palestinian Authority. They don't give them control over natural resources. They don't give them control over borders. And so what you see on the right-hand side, this is one way. So this is gross fixed capital formation, just another word for investment. And one way that we gauge if there are employment opportunities created is building versus non-building investment. And you can see, regardless of the level of international aid, the vast majority of investment in Palestine remains what we call buildings versus non-buildings, which kind of just tells us about that dependency. The second one is actually dependency on private debt. So you have all these Palestinians that are still increasing buying things. There's more trade deficit. Where are they getting their money? From private debt. And again, this is the time around 2007, 2008, when that prime minister that I was mentioning came about. But it is not just economic, right? There is also kind of this failure, and maybe Amal can also talk about this a little bit more, on what I call political domestication. There's this famous incident where General Keith Dayton, a US general, came to Palestine to train these new Palestinians, right? New Palestinian forces. And in one of the, it's recorded, it's on YouTube, in one of the interviews or panels or lectures, he's saying, I got a phone call from the Israeli commander as soon as he met these new Palestinian professional security forces. And he was saying, how many more of these new Palestinians can you generate and how quickly. And so the way that, and I'm not just putting this to see my picture getting beaten up over here, but these are different pictures from the West Bank where you see on the right hand on the top there, this is not an Israeli tank. This is a Palestinian Authority police jeep. These are not Israelis. These are Palestinian authorities stopping Palestinian protesters from protesting and reaching the Israeli side. And on the right hand, on the lower right hand, you have what is called the Lion's Den group. So young Palestinians who are kind of saying, if the Palestinian Authority is not going to protect us in the West Bank against these daily intrusions, that we're going to mobilize ourselves and we're going to have something that is done by ourselves. And so I think the Palestinian Authority is a very important question here economically. And again, part of it is not their fault, but a big part is, and we can talk more about that, have continued those dependencies, created new dependencies, but also politically very dangerously, I would say, sometimes directly, indirectly, intentionally, non-intentionally, kind of adopting that narrative of the Israeli occupation. And in one sense, you know, we talk about security coordination all the time, right? You were talking, Shloka, about this kind of like the internal thing that we don't like to talk about. The Palestinian Authority, one of its main goals, probably one of the few goals that it achieves now, is protecting Israelis, is protecting Israel. And that's something that is obviously very devastating when we're seeing everything that is going on, but it's also part of the reality. And I do think it has to do way back to when you go to the 1990s, what Israel was thinking in terms of what Amal called that self-rule. It was probably one of those things that it did want to achieve through this agreement. So I'm sorry, I talked a lot about that, but I did want to mention that. I thought that was a very good question to.
I really enjoyed how you instantly had graphics for it. Unfortunately, we're going to move on to our last question for the day. And I think it's a good note to end on. If you were able to decide now, I know I wanted to answer that one, how to proceed regarding Palestine and Israel politically, what would be your suggested solution to reach political liberation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to whoever asked this question. I think this is a really important question because we do get it quite often. And I want to mention that we also get quite often in that, when people ask, what would be your suggested solution? Would it be two states or would it be one state? It's phrased in state terminology, right? And that's normal because these are actually the labyrinths that we've been, going on a ride on for the last 30 years or so. However, I just really want to caution, which is when I talk about, strategic objectives and strategy, it's not just to understand sort of Israel's strategic objectives, it's so that we can also understand how to respond strategically, okay? So I think strategically, we need to focus, when we talk about solutions, no longer, we do not need to focus on states and statehood scenarios. We should take ourselves out of that sort of rabbit hole, right, and talk about rights. Because actually, the key issue, I think, in my opinion, is Israel is not really, it's not about being wedded to one idea of some kind of solution versus another. The key idea is maintaining a system of preferential rights for Jewish versus Palestinian people in the land of historic Palestine. And because that's the key issue, I think talks of statehood may actually obfuscate it, right? Maybe not intentionally. So I think when we talk about solutions, I think we should divest ourselves from the notion that we're picking between statehood scenarios, because we're actually not, right? All we should focus on is Israel is an apartheid state. Its main objective is to maintain a system of preferential rights for Jewish versus non-Jewish people in the land under its control. And that's what our discourse for how to overcome that in the future should be. So our discourse should be focused on, we demand equality of rights, whether the right of return for refugees, equal rights of citizenship for Palestinians within Israel, political rights for people in the occupied territories. I mean, we don't need to put the burden on us to talk about certain, statehood forms or bureaucratic forms, because that's actually what the distraction is, right? And it takes away from this idea, the core issue, which is that this is a system of racist preferential rights. And so our response should always be, in proceeding forward, our suggested solution is a system not based on preferential rights, right? And then take the political struggle from there. Whatever bureaucratic form it takes, that's also something for the Palestinian people to kind of figure out also within themselves and given whatever existing balance of power may take place. But I think focusing on a rights-based discourse as the solution forward is much more effective also in exposing the Israeli state than any other kind of discourse, including state-based discourse. So that would be my suggestion. And that's why I think the BDS movement was really genius and has been seen as so threatening even back when it started 20 years ago when it still didn't have a lot of traction because it was centered on a rights-based discourse. And that really gets at the core of what Zionism does not want, right? And so we should stick to that, I think. Yeah.
And I think I'm going to take the lead from Amal here. And while she was talking, I kind of jotted down three things, right? Equal rights, that's number one. Number two, redistribution, from my perspective, of land, wealth, and capital. And number three, trying war criminals plus reconciliation type courts similar to South Africa for the lower case, military war criminals. I think in the future, whatever kind of resolution would have to entail, in my mind, those three things, if we are talking about a sustainable future for that part of the world.
Thank you very much for this answer, but also for the rest of these talks. I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we could not get through, but I do think we covered some similar questions along the lines. Yeah, thank you for everyone who attended. This is supposed to be the first of a series of events by Rethink Economics. We didn't want to just start with a lecture series because we understand there's a lot more we can do as an international network. So our next event is going to be a roundtable for students to attend and let us know exactly how they want Rethink to be responding to the situation, if that could look like curating resources or whatever everyone comes up with. So thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone who attended, and thanks Ibrahim and Shloka and Ross.
Thank you all.